thanks to Stephanie and the whole staff here at Malaprops. As someone who goes around the country and talks at bookstores, it's really important to support your local independent bookstore, and Malaprops is one of the best. So round of applause. Well, this is such a wonderful opportunity because a few years ago, I got to meet Marjorie. And the reason was this: I was doing my book, The Secret Token, on the Lost Colony, and I ran across this wonderful book called Searching for Virginia Dare. It was a nonfiction book, not just about the history of the first English child born in the Americas, but also about how women today relate to her. And so I tracked her down, went to Chapel Hill. We spent a wonderful afternoon hanging out, just talking about Lost Colony, about indigenous peoples, and hit it off and had a great time. And I really got a lot of insight from her. So I'm grateful to have made that connection. And now it's great to see her as a novelist. So Marjorie grew up in Washington, DC, and she ended up moving here to the South, lucky for us. And I won't mention, she's written so many essays and poems and stories in various magazines and anthologies, topics from fishing in ponds to Sufi dancing. She's very versatile in her interests. And she also wrote a book called, it was a story collection called Accidental Birds of the Carolinas. It was shortlisted for the PEN/Hemingway Award. And I'm sure you can track that one down. But she's not just a person like me who sits in front of their laptop all day. She actually is a community activist there in the area around Chatham County. She works on the board of the Black Historical Society there. She mentors at-risk children. She's really somebody who gets out there and does stuff in the community, not just on a screen. And we'll talk obviously about this book that she's written, Indigo Field, but I think what I love most about this is that she goes to places where nonfiction, boring nonfiction people like me can't go. And she's trying to tell a history that is not in the textbooks. It's very hard to tell because a lot of the documents simply aren't there. So this is what I got out of this book, was a way of understanding North Carolina history that allows people who have not had a voice in the telling of that history to actually be heard. So I was really excited and happy to read this book, because I think at this moment in our history, when there's a lot of reckoning around the past, particularly in the South, Marjorie's done us a great service, and plus it's a really, really fun read. So all that said, I would like to introduce Marjorie Hudson. Please make her welcome.
Good to be here talking with you, Andrew. Just always have a good time and get smarter when I talk to you.
Well, so I'm going to grab the mic again and just ask you a little bit about this book, because it's such a fascinating, sprawling history, but told through a very few characters. I wonder if maybe you might start us off by reading something that might give people a little bit of the context of what this is.
I'd be delighted to. So I'll start from the very beginning, which gives you a sense of the tone of the book. It's been called magical realism. I think of it more as mystical realism. And let me just get started with the very beginning. Tucked between the Cedar River and the monstrous pines of the Gully Ridge lies an ancient field, tangled and wild, knee-high with last year's scrub, strewn with rocks the size of crouching men and sleeping deer. Its soil is deep and loamy. It has been planted, but never plowed. It is spring, and up on the ridge, a breeze lifts the broad crowns of the Gully pines, releasing yellow clouds of pollen that float across the highway and come to rest on every flat surface of Stonehaven Downs Retirement Village, including the hood of Colonel Randolph Jefferson Lee's new Honda Accord. West of the ridge, across Spill Creek, the breeze raises wild bees from the hollow heart of Miss Reba's sycamore. The bees rise up from that dark cove of sweetness, hover over 3 strange cedar statues in the yard, then head across the creek and through the woods. They pause over Jolene Lake's tidy fields, then glimmer up the Goulet Ridge and gather among the old pines, humming. The Goulet pines have lived through drought and flood. They know the glaze of ice and the glimmer of sun on their cracked, cupped bark, each scale like a small ear, alert for sound. The giant trunks sense the movements of vast oceans. They taste the breeze and know a storm will rise along the coast of Africa. They listen to the stories of the field.
Great, thank you. So the trees, the Goulet pines are in a way important characters beyond the human characters. And I'm curious how you came to give them voice, quite literally in the novel.
Yeah, it's where I live is the dominant citizenry are trees, most of them pines, and open fields, as many open fields, more open fields than there are small towns or even crossroads. So to tell the story about a community, I wanted to include the things that people see and feel the most. And the trees, to me, I have a little bit of a mystical relationship with trees in my world. So they needed to have a voice, and they were a convenient source of an omniscient view. They live longer generally than most people. And I loved the idea of them recording history and knowing things that people are pretending they don't know or that they're not paying attention to. So because I had an omniscient voice available to me in the form of a tree or grove of trees, the Goulet, it made a touchstone for the history that rises, and it made a device that I could use to summarize the story, since there are very many characters' voices that are human in the story as well.
Great. Well, let's move to the humans in the story. You mentioned Colonel Randolph Jefferson Lee as a Virginian. I can appreciate that name, also known as Rand, shortened Rand in the story. He came across to me at the beginning as a really clueless old white guy, but you managed to turn him into something more than a two-dimensional character. But I wonder if you could speak about him a bit.
Yeah, you know, I love him. Some people don't, not at first. He's a character who's doesn't he's a fish out of water. He doesn't love being retired. I think that's true of a lot of men when they're not sure of where their path is going after a career. But more than that, he's got some kind of hauntings from his past and burdens that he's carrying, and those kinds of things become more evident as we move into the story. In addition, he's got a pretty serious heart condition. He has a plan to do things that he's not supposed to do, including run up a hill into the Goulet Pines and either get better or die in a place that's not a hospital. So he has this kind of dire situation of his own creation, and that makes him really interesting to me. I also set him on a path to move outward from his community of safety, from his community of privilege, and to have some kind of surprising connections with the people around him, so that he gets to move towards some understanding. And that's really fun for me. In a way, and I don't talk about this very much, in a way, he tracks what I call my white ignorance journey. When I first moved to North Carolina as an outsider, I'm not much like him, but I did have just a kind of I'm not very aware of the layers of history that were around me. When I began to uncover them as an activist and as a member of my community, I became fascinated, and that was a story I wanted to tell. It takes Rand a little bit longer, than it did me.
So that brings us to Miss Reba Jones, who's such a fine character, a woman who really knows where she's from, grounded in the current lingo, in a way that the white characters never seem to be able to be. So talk a little bit about her and her role.
Yeah, so Miss Reba Jones knows everything that's been going on in her community for a long time. And she specifically, as a Black woman, as an elder in the community, and as a woman who's aware that she has Tuscarora heritage, she keeps track of crimes against her people by white men in the back of the family Bible. She's aware that because of her present situation, her niece that she raised to adulthood has just been murdered, and she's observing the court case, the charges against him, and watching them being diminished to a very small sentence. And she kind of rages against injustice, and she's in this strange kind of grief that is mingled with rage in her particular case. She also communes with spirits, and I'm very careful to defy stereotype in this book. It'd be very easy to play with stereotype, but I believe that most of us commune with spirits in some ways. Some of us may not be aware we are, but when Rand's story gets going, he starts communing with the dead as well. But one of the ways she communes with the dead is by talking to the sort of awareness of the little girl that was her niece Danielle. And this little awareness keeps showing up as a kind of a rustle in the pantry or a little sound on the porch roof. And she becomes aware that this spirit starts to speak to her and make demands of her. And that really throws the story into a pitch where she gets in a lot of trouble doing things that she'd rather not do.
So let's zoom out a little bit. And maybe it's just the nonfiction nerd in me, but it seemed to me that through these characters, you're trying to tell a different kind of North Carolina history, kind of history that I wasn't taught. And did you have this kind of overarching goal, or I mean, how did you choose to pull together these characters, and what are you trying to say?
So the story evolved from my personal experiences in my community, and there were two areas that I'll tell you about. One was that I went to my daughter's school, Horton Middle School, one day and realized that nobody knew who the school was named for. Correction, nobody was talking about who the school was named for. I did a little research and discovered that my Black friends and neighbors knew who the school was named for, and my white friends and neighbors had a different story or really had no idea. Well, the school was named for the first Black man to publish a book in the South. He sold his poems to buy his freedom. He lived enslaved for 65 years in Chatham County. What an extraordinary story. If you read his poems, I hope you will. I have a little mention of him in the book because he's my favorite. You'll learn how inspiring he was. But that moment, when I realized that what Black people know about history and what white people know about history are two different things, was something I really wanted to address in the work, because as an activist in my community, I was learning more and more about what Black people knew that I didn't know and that didn't know. The second thing was I was doing some research for an essay, a historical essay about the 20 nations of Native people who lived in North and South Carolina, in addition to the Cherokee. And that surprised me. I didn't know about them. I learned a lot from doing my research. And one of the things I did was go to the site of a Tuscarora village and learn from a man who lived nearby what was buried underneath the ground that had not been recognized in any way. And one of the things that was buried there was a pot of peach pits that were part of the treasure of the Tuscarora people who lived on that site. Now you might think peaches are not from this continent, and you would be right. They were brought by the Spanish, who came in very early migrations and explorations inland in North and South Carolina. And something about that captured my attention. Tuscarora people were planting orchards of peach trees and enjoying them the same way that you and I do. And they were just in love with peaches. And so that's part of history that we don't know much about, but it got in my imagination and made the people who had made this community many, many years ago come alive for me. I also, at the same time, was starting to do some activist work with my environmental community. And at a river festival, Chief John Blackfeather got up and gave a blessing. And I also learned that a friend of mine's daughter was adopted from the Lumbee Nation. I also researched a book about Virginia Dare and learned more about the living people that I had to learn from to learn more about the past. So I became aware that unlike in Washington, D.C., I just didn't travel in circles that were inclusive, that I now was meeting all different kinds of people because I live in a small rural community, and in every community that's small and rural, everyone is important. Everybody counts. So those two elements of my own experience made me want to tell a story, and I wasn't really sure exactly what I wanted to say at first, but I knew it had something to do with the fact that I was beginning to understand something that people around me weren't talking about very much. And it bothered me, and I wanted to kind of raise it up. And of course, in fiction, the way to do that is through emotional connection. The third thing I will tell you about is that one day I was running down my farm road, and a man came jogging toward me. This was about 30 years ago. He had the hat, he had the shoes, he had the shorts. He was older, quite a bit older than me. And it was one of those things where this person, I've never seen a jogger in the county where I live. And, you know, you just never saw joggers. You saw them in cities, but not down a farm road in the middle of the country in those days. I thought, wonder where he's from. You know, you ain't from around here. So I was already like, taking on that role. Well, then I thought about it and I said, well, he's probably from a retirement village across the highway. So I knew folks from there, and I said, that makes sense. You know, he's from a different culture. He's a runner, he's older, that all makes sense. But just as he was passing me, he gave me this look of utter devastation, and it threw me back. And I kept going, and he kept going, and I thought, what in the world was going on in this man's life? That he could look at me that way, and that he could keep going, that he would keep going. And that haunted me for days, and that gave me a personal entry into a fictional character that I now call the Colonel Randolph Jefferson, a man who has a personal problem, a serious devastation in his life, and who somehow keeps going.
Beautiful, thank you. One or two more questions, and then we'll get to the audience. So the elephant in the room, as it were, is, as a white woman, what was it like to write about Black and Indigenous peoples? How did you navigate that? And what was the process like for you?
You know, I think I started with an emotional connection, an awareness. And I think there's some rules about doing that. I think, first of all, you have to start with accuracy. And because I have such a diverse community, I have a friend who gives a lot of talks about identity politics. And she read my book and she said, well, you know, you identify as a community person. And she sort of got that I don't feel I have a narrow identity. And it allowed me access, because I had access in my work to all different kinds of people. And also, as a fiction writer, you must have empathy, and it's either a gift or it's something that you develop somehow. So empathy is required. And as I guess you could tell that whenever I tell the story about this man talking toward me, there are times when people move me deeply, and it's something I can't put a barrier down about. So when I was working with characters, I thought about how they might feel, and I worked in human emotion. And you know, of course, the last thing is respect, and that is just to look and make sure that your language is both accurate while you're telling an emotional story, that you're telling the story of a real human being, somebody who feels very human, because they have flaws, they have foibles, they have sensitivities, they have difficulties, and they're vulnerable. You know, Brene Brown tells us the way we have courage is by accepting our vulnerability. So all these characters have an arc that requires courage of them. So that awareness and awareness of language, how different people speak, I did a lot of work with making sure I wasn't abusing identity by crossing into first person language, or making sure that any small elements of dialect related to the emotional life of the character. And I believe that I've done that with a great deal of respect. I'm still in love with the characters, and I'm loving that people are reading them.
Thank you. So I guess one last question. I'm curious, since I'm kind of on the nonfiction side and you can go back and forth between those two, what do you think a book like this can bring to the bigger cultural conversation about race, about history, about who gets left out, who's heard and who's not?
Yeah, I have some hopes about that. Thanks. I hope that when people read this book, they might think about having a conversation with a neighbor. They might think about crossing a boundary themselves. They might think about, I don't know how to do that. Can I find out how? They might think about, yes, we need to teach history because it's moving and it's important. We need to raise up hidden history, and I brought in, you know, lots of history in the story. And how do we negotiate this through respect and connection? And at some point, I think I will put a list on my website of things that you can do. But for now, I hope people read my book and think about that, and feel the beautiful vulnerability of all these different kinds of people and how they can be heroes in our world. So.
And I don't want to give anything away, but I'm just curious, were you ever in a hurricane? Because it sure sounds like you've been in one.
I've been in 3 hurricanes. Let's see, but Hurricane Fran was a big influence on this story. That happened in the 90s when I was first hatching the story. And so it was vivid in my mind, the terror of the eye of a hurricane came over our farm, and we lost an apple orchard, and a large tree behind our house saved herself by losing a major limb and plunging it 5 feet into the ground in order to prop herself up against the wind. And I love this tree. She's old, she's lost a lot of limbs, but she's a survivor. So yeah, that kind of, you know, there have been more hurricanes where I live, and when I was researching the Virginia Dare book, there were 3 hurricanes that chased me up the coast. So, but that one was vivid. And I know you've had them come inland here as well.
Well, anyway, like I said, don't want to give too much away, but it certainly felt like I was in the eye of the storm, that part of the novel. Okay, so why don't we open it up to questions? And what I'll do is I will repeat the question, so that the folks that are online that are listening can participate as well and understand. So somebody be brave and raise your hand. We can sit here all night. Yes, sir.
This book, your collection of short stories, you had Ram that interest there. How long did it work on?
So the question is how long she's been working on the two characters, Ran and Miss Reba.
Right, so yes, I wrote a story about Rand that is similar to the opening of the novel, and that was published in around 2011 in Accidental Birds of the Carolinas as the title story. And
You need to unlock your iPhone.
there's always oh gosh, there's also a novella in the story collection that introduces Jolene. It's kind of her life story up to about 10 years before the novel. I wrote it as backstory for the novel, and then I said, hey, this is a fun story. This has a shape to it. I'm gonna, make it a novella, and I love novellas, so I went crazy with that. And it introduces Miss Reba Jones. She came in, she kind of snuck into that story, and I thought, boy, I want to know more about her. And the way writers find out about their characters is by making up more about them. So just that developed. And then Bobo is Jolene's son. He also was first in that long novella that made me want to write more.
Okay, next question, please.
You take the virtual call?
Yeah, oh yeah, virtual. Yeah, sure.
Do you want to talk a little bit more, Marjorie, about how long it took to write the book and its many iterations?
I'd be delighted. Did everybody hear that? Okay.
I think everybody heard that.
Yeah. How long did it take? And how many iterations and all that sort of thing? Yes. Well, the moment when I saw the Colonel character, when I hatched him, was in 1993. It's being published now in 2023. I wasn't writing this the whole time. I published 2 other books, and I went and got an MFA and worked different jobs. But yeah, it took a long time, partly to find out what I knew. And I am a writer who loves to write long and go down rabbit holes. So I did a lot of research. So much fun, that research, right? Whoa. I even spent time, the most fun I think was watching parrot videos and parrot swearing videos on YouTube. That was a perk. I kind of went on and on with that a little too long. So at one point I had 450 pages, not quite the ending, not quite knowing what I was writing about, and that was around 1999. And then in 2016, I had about 800 pages. So I knew that wasn't right because I couldn't even keep track of what was going on. And I was convinced to do some cutting by my writers group. And the novel went through many, 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 many whole cloth revisions to get to its current length. My method was partly not just to kind of keep writing in the mornings before my job from time to time. I'm not somebody who believes you have to write every day, but you do have to schedule time where you can write every day so that your brain can do the subconscious work to bring mystery to the surface. And so I arranged for some long residencies at writers' residencies in Sausalito and in Wyoming. And I have a regular residency place in North Carolina that I go where I can really focus and spin out the long versions and put post-it notes on the wall. with different colors for different characters, and begin to understand what I was doing. That's a little bit.
Great, thank you. Now let's return here. Yes, ma'am.
So, when you were doing your research, did you only do it in talks with watching go?
So the question is, when you were doing your research, did you primarily do books, or did you go out in the community and talk to elders and people of color?
I read a lot of books, but that intersection with real people was a constant. I did not go to people to interview them to find out what they knew. I felt that was strangely intrusive in an emotional story, but I attend conferences. I'm an activist in my community, so I served on boards, spent a lot of time being the only white person in the room for certain things that I was trying to lead on. And went to powwows, I went to dig sites, I talked to all different kinds of people as part of research for other things and as my daily life. So to earn somebody's trust, primarily for me, relies on being interested and really caring a lot to hear a story. You know, one of the elements, for example, of the story that I realized later was part of the impetus, part of the real life inspiration was that there was a grandmother that I worked with, and I was mentoring a child in the family. And one day she liked to talk, and I was happy to listen. One day she turned to me out of the blue and said, "Our people were never slaves, they were Indians." And I thought, my goodness, because everyone in the family was some kind of shade of Black. What an interesting thing for me to learn was the life of someone that had been concealed to most people. So that, because this woman was part of my life, in the normal course of things, she felt confident to talk to me about something special. So that's an example.
Thank you. Any questions online?
Character development. Question about how you take a particular character people, how you develop that character, and did you get a snag with it?
Great question. I had so many snags, like, hard to find this one. Character development. Let's talk about Bobo. He's a minor character, but he also has a hero's journey. Bobo is a Down syndrome boy about 19, trying to be a young man, wanting to be a young man, and his mother is struggling with him as a single mom and knowing how to care for him and how to help him. So one of the snags I ran into was not so much his emotional life. I'm around Down syndrome people in my community. The emotional life of Down syndrome people is various, but for this particular character, he was joyful and moody. He was a teenager kind of person. But the thing I really had to stop and think about was his, and this is technical for writers, is it okay to have his inner monologue, his self-talk, be in the kind of special language that he might use when he's speaking out loud? Because his language is just a little bit different from the people around him. They just what he emphasizes in his language and so on. And I decided, I had some pretty good advice. I decided that, the inner lives of people is a language of not what other people would hear, but what is understood by the reader and by the writer. So it does not have to be special language. It's just in the speaking out loud that we might have the rhythms of a special language for a particular character. And that was true for Black dialect as well. There's a lot of technicalities that I could get into about how emotion changes the inner monologue, and emotion changes the outer dialogue, as far as length of sentences, as far as emphasis in sentences. When we're mad, we speak differently from when we're just talking. So all of those things are things I can try to pay attention to with great respect. Just one more thing, I had a voice that I was using to tell the story that was kind of like the big trees, you know, it was somewhat omniscient, removed, a white person with authority. And I thought, oh boy, this is not quite working for Miss Reba. And I wanted, she kind of said to me, you know, I need to speak in my voice. So I gave her an exception to my dialect rule by allowing her to speak out loud. She got to use her voice and tell her story in oral histories in certain kinds of scenes. So does that make sense that I tell that in a coherent way? Yeah. So that was part of the struggle of the technicalities of the work and how to be respectful while telling an emotional story.
Thanks. Question in the back? Yes. So the question is about, you mentioned the Horton School, and can you discuss a little bit about children and how that factors into what you've been writing?
Yes. Well, let me first tell you a little bit more about the Horton Middle School intersection with my life. When I saw that this extraordinary person was not getting respect at home, and that the Black people in my community who knew and loved his story were not getting respect, I didn't know what to do. But the first thing I did is I got strategic and I applied for a historic marker, and that took a while, but I did some primary research and found out some new things. So I did some, I don't know, some kind of like side strategy work. Let's make sure people locally know that this person is important because the state said so, right? So once you have that, the physical object, and I hope people do this with Black history when they discover it, and I see they are starting to in many places. You can apply for a historic marker. That's one way you can be a white ally if you have the time and the resources to do that. So that meant that the children, if they were driving by with their parents, would see that. But that wasn't enough. And so in the year 2000 was the anniversary of Horton entering age 3, an enslaved child entering the county from a different place with his family and the family of his master. So it was a great kind of bicentennial moment, year 2000. I got this idea to go to my middle school principal and my local arts council and say, why don't we have a celebration for the children? And I asked the student, we had meetings with the faculty and they got very excited. And it was kind of magical. I was very fortunate. Everybody got behind it because I promised to raise funds and bring educators, fun projects, and so on to the campus during the fall semester. Now, this was before they did testing all the time, just before. So by some kind of miracle, we were able to kind of take over the curriculum and say, let's celebrate George Moses Horton, make sure everybody knows who he is. Because his story is about freedom, because his story is about how he found allies, because his story is about being unstoppable despite many odds. It's a perfect story to tell young children, and the 5th and 6th, 7th and 8th graders became very involved in the project and we're very proud of it. So zoom ahead, and we made it fun. So zoom ahead, 27 years later, I'm working with my NAACP. I'm a member of my local chapter, and we finally put together a petition to change the name of the school to more accurately reflect its namesake, and we succeeded. And it was right after we had been attacked by white supremacists with big flags and weapons who came to our town. So I am so happy that happened. And I think partly because of this ongoing encouragement by a kind of an ignorant white lady walking into the fray and saying, oh, let's do this. I think people were emboldened to speak up who've been thinking about speaking up for a long time. So that was my kind of full on a journey contribution. And now the school celebrates George Moses Horton on a special day every year, like History Month. Every child gets a children's book based on that story. And there are 5 art installations and places around campus, including the media center, that celebrate the history of the school as a segregated school, which is when it got its original name. So that's how you can bring history to raise up all the children by inspiring them and just being very positive about it. I hope that answers some of it.
Great, thank you. Any questions online?
Question about place. How do you develop a sense of place? What's a place that's in your mind? Or would you like to draw inspiration?
First, you take off your shoes. Then you go lie down in the grass and you listen and you hope the fire ants don't get you. I think to be in a place you need the sensory attack of the air on your skin. It's hard to be in your imagination with that unless you actually physically can relate to it. And then the body starts working on the mind, don't you feel? The body gives kind of has its own brain, its body brain that works in memory and works in sensory awareness in order to magically transform writing and to make it real through detail, through the feeling of the grass, through the visual of the sun glinting through the trees. I feel you have to be there. I negotiated many years ago to possibly ghostwrite a novel. Such hubris. That's before I'd written a novel. But I knew one thing. I didn't end up doing it, but I knew one thing, and that was that I had to go be on site where the novel was had taken place. It was a historical novel, and the place was still there, and I had to live there for a while. And those were part of the expenses that would have to be incurred to ghost write a novel. I'd have to feel it, right? And we feel through our skin and through our, we have emotional reactions to our physical world. And so the emotion comes partly from that.
Great, thanks. Another question from the audience? Yes. So the question is, can you talk a little bit about how you developed an emotional or a spiritual relationship with trees? Mystical, I think, is the word.
I think as a child, I probably knew I had a mystical relationship with trees, and I posit that most young children who've been outside and who've been laid on a blanket or in a crib and looking up near a tree have imprinted on the shifting light that happens when the sun comes through tree leaves and branches. And I just think that's primal, but also as just a kind of an awareness of that as an adult has come from being in nature. I was a nature writer for National Parks Magazine. Every time I'm in nature, I know where I belong. Right? I think that was enhanced into heartbreak by watching clear cuts and listening to clear cuts and hearing the thud of a tree falling to the ground. And there are, lots of those where I live from time to time. So, and I just think in recent years, during our COVID years, in order to survive, I spent a lot of time talking to a particular tree. And yes, the tree appeared to be talking back, and I believe it was talking back. It happens to be a tree that has really beautiful lift when there's a breeze. And of course, I would say, "Good morning, beautiful. I love you." And she would go, "I love you too." And then sometimes there would be no breeze, and she was that. So that relationship, I think, is there for us if we're paying attention. And if we read books like Braiding Sweetgrass, which I read just recently, that's rooted in the indigenous author's kind of sense of things and how the world actually works. Part of the argument being that, yes, the tree loves you. The tree is giving you oxygen, because without it, you would die. The tree is living its life and getting bigger, so it can give you more oxygen. So more of us can live, and we in turn are breathing on the trees and giving them, I always forget which one, I bet you know, carbon monoxide, dioxide, the good one, the one that the trees like. And so it is this symbiotic relationship that is quite perfect and magical. It's also scientifically proven. So that's kind of what I would tell you about that. And I hope that one of my book club questions is there a place that you go, a grove of trees that you love? Let's have a field trip, and people go around the circle and they talk about places that were special to them as children, and where they felt spoken to.
Great, thank you. Another question here? Anybody else?
First one to the two of you.
Sure.
So this is a variation on a theme of place, but when I first wrote the book, he sent me an article about Cahokia. And I would be interested to hear your description of the meaning of Cahokia as a place now then, when it was constructed. I communicate that to the same question or resonance of something that's past, how the modern viewer could nothing to see here, tree, nothing to see here. How do you tap into
You first.
Well, I could certainly quote Faulkner. I mean, the past is not dead; it's not even past. And I think your book is a great example of that. The way in which we think that we clear cut, we put in the subdivision, and we have erased what went before. But of course, that's an illusion because it's still there. It's either physically there to archaeologists, and she has an archaeologist in her book. I was delighted to see you can find the physical remains, but also there's something else that remains behind. When humans live in a place for a long time, there is something there. Maybe you can't detect it with a scientific instrument, but that seems to be the case. And certainly, I think your novel is a great example of bringing out that emotional resonance that exists in a place that may have been altered forever. I mean, where we're sitting here, 300 years ago was quite a different place, but that history is still very much alive. At least that's what I believe, that history is never past. It's here with us.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're haunted by history whether we know it or not. I think that some people, just as they're sensitive to cold weather, might be more sensitive, more aware of the kind of resonance of history around them. You know how when you're a traveler in a new place, say you went to Paris, and you're like, oh, look at this, look at that, ooh, breezing my hair. There's a sensitivity that happens when you're in a new place, when you're not from there. I think some of that happened to me, that awareness of the physical world and the hauntedness of history started rising up in me as just an essential knowledge. And so, I also think that stories are emotional, and that stories about history are emotional. And if you have strong feelings or feel haunted by the past, and if, like in my case, I think I have a strong sense of justice, and it's just kind of internalized. I'm like, how come people aren't talking about this? How come people don't know about this? I wanted it to be known. So that was part of my personal haunting about the past rising.
Great. Thank you very much. Yes, in the back. Okay, the question is, you mentioned the person who said we were never slaves, we were Indians. Can you speak to that?
I can say that the lady I spoke to didn't have much more to say about that, but I did think myself that what she meant was, you don't know something about my family. And I know that most white people think that most Black people living in the South came out of slavery, but of course there's a whole variety of things that happened historically between Black people, enslaved people, and Native American indigenous people. So I think she had a story she wanted to tell that was covered up by her Black skin. And many indigenous people intermarried with Black people and are not known by people unless they pass along this story. There are certain stereotypes we have about certain skin colors. One very moving thing I've discovered by going to a powwow recently is that many indigenous people go to powwows to find their family because there are no records. They are doing DNA research and they're finding out some things, but there are no written records to compare them to, because indigenous and Black people were grouped together in all the US Census material. So that's kind of my response to what she was trying to say and how I interpret.
Beautiful, thank you. Okay,
Final question.
Anybody? Do we have another question?
Favorite scene?
There's a question back there.
Okay.
So the question is, could you talk a little bit about your involvement with the story of Virginia Dare?
Oh goodness, yes.
You have to start, because she wrote the book before I wrote mine.
Yes, I am the international expert on Virginia Dare. Yeah, I love the story of Virginia Dare, and I came to it by accident and also by curiosity. As you may know, I am very fascinated with the history of the South, with the past is never past aspect of that. And I kept hearing the name Virginia Dare at a literary conference. People would mention it, and every time that name came up, it was kind of spooky, and it was kind of a secret handshake because kids in North Carolina grow up with the story of Virginia Dare. I knew about Sir Walter Raleigh and the potato, but I didn't know about Virginia Dare. That kind of pissed me off, you know. So when I got the offer to write about some kind of women's history in North Carolina through a publishing company and an editor named Emily Wilson, I hope you know the name. She's an extraordinary historian of women in North Carolina. I picked Virginia Dare because I didn't know anything about her. My first bit of research, my first research moment, I called up a museum down east, down near the coast, and a woman answered the phone, and I said, "Hi, I'm Marjorie Hudson. I'm researching whatever became of Virginia Dare." There was a silence on the line, and the woman said, "Good luck." So I knew it was going to be a fun journey. And then I just kind of kept following around and ended up telling a personal story, because the story of Virginia Dare is a story of family loss. And that's what came up for me. I ended up telling history material from primary sources. And then I would move into imagination. It's a very weird book. It was really fun to write. And I interviewed people, and there were lots of people out there obsessed with Virginia Dare. Turns out I'm one of them now. And more recently, after I got to know Andrew and his very interesting work that went far beyond what I was able to do in a small book, we both ended up being in a documentary about the Lost Colony and archaeology and the current status of, you could say more. But I discovered that my job was to stand in front of a Virginia Dare statue that I'd done a lot of research about. He's laughing because he knows what's coming. They had just cleaned the statue, and I was to talk about white supremacy and how white supremacy had become identified with the Virginia Dare story, which was news to me. So I had learned some of that from Andrew. And so my job was to stand before this statue in the middle of Elizabethan Gardens, which they had just cleaned, and it was whiter than white, whiter than any white person you've ever seen. And I got to talk about white supremacy. And so that was a really interesting rite of passage for me. And I've since been talking more, researching more, writing more about that. Take it away, Andrew.
Well, I don't think I need to add anything to that, because I never got to stand in front of that statue with cameras pointed at me.
She's making
Yeah, she is. And she also spent some time at the bottom of the Mediterranean, like her shipwreck when she was coming from Rome. But that's another story.
Such a good story.
So I would like us all to give a hand to Marjorie Hudson.